Warm greetings, salaman, dabasuhuje, and welcome back to the Izuka podcast. I'm Zai. Let us try to understand some key factors that led us to where we are, focusing on some key periods, pre-colonial and colonial, and maybe at a later stage we can do another episode where we can look at post-colonial. We'll explore how these eras shaped the African landscape, both economically and socially. So let's begin by taking a look at pre-colonial period. In pre-colonial Africa, the population density was generally low and people were spread across vast areas. Land was abundant, but labor was scarce. And this balance meant that conflicts over land were uncommon and there was little need for formal property rights. Pastoralists, those who lived off domesticated animals, could move freely in search of grazing land without clashing with farmers. And farmers, on the other hand, practiced extensive agriculture, moving to new fields when the land was exhausted or when yields needed to increase. Now, if we zoom in on West Africa, societies were more specialized than elsewhere on the continent, and over time, this specialization grew, especially in trade. Initially, gold dominated the region's trade, but copper and salt became increasingly important for the long-distance trade, particularly across the Sahara. And by the 13th century, indigenous gold mining was well established, and this gold trade was traded with Islamic merchants along the East African coast. However, this system was disrupted in the 16th century when the Portuguese sought to monopolize the gold trade. Now, while most trade in pre-colonial Africa was local, it was well organized. Market systems were well structured with rotating market days between villages. Some even held neutral ground. Now, regional currencies like imported seashells and locally produced cloth facilitated trade. Okay, now let's move on to the colonial period, right? An era that significantly altered Africa's economic and political landscape. But first, what exactly is colonialism, right? So colonialism occurs when one country takes complete control over another, and often exploiting it for political power and economic gain. In Africa, this largely took place between the 1800s and the 1960s, driven by various motivations. Colonialism was not a mistake, misunderstanding, or a grievous deviation from proper norms of behavior. It was not an accident of human error. It was not an unthinking reversion of barbarism. In fact, on the contrary, this was conceived as the moral justification or the necessary justification as it was seen by those in the white man's world who were neither thieves nor moral monsters for doing to Black people what church and state no longer thought permissible to do to white people. Okay, so European countries colonized Africa for several reasons. The Industrial Revolution changed their economies and technology, leading to more production. However, agriculture couldn't keep up with the demand for raw materials needed by these industries. So countries like Britain looked for resources outside their borders. Additionally, as farming declined, it became harder to produce enough food for the growing urban populations, making it tough for rural areas to feed the cities. And with their rapid growth in technology, new products were being made faster than people could use them. And Africa, with its large population, became a perfect market for these products. Additionally, Low wages meant that industrialists in Europe were making profits faster than they could reinvest them. And this led to surplus of capital that needed to be reinvested elsewhere, which contributed to the rise of imperialism. Now, when Europe pioneered industrial capitalism, her demands upon the resources of the world increased tremendously. In addition to obtaining spices for her tables and manpower for her mines and plantations in the Americas, Europe set out to seize for her factories the minerals and agricultural resources of the world. And as Europe's demand for global resources skyrocketed, their interest in Africa deepened. European traders who had long operated on Africa's coast were no longer satisfied with the way things were, and they wanted to push inland to take direct control of African resources and maximize profit by basically cutting out the African middleman. Obviously, naturally, Africa's coastal rulers resisted these invasions and fought to maintain their way of life, right? Leading to clashes as Europeans tried to dominate both trade and territory. This is where colonialism truly took hold. So European nations began to take over African economies, not just to extract resources, but to reshape their entire societies to serve European interests, essentially. The strategies they used to maintain control over African states. The colonialists used several methods to make Africans submit to their rule, including conquest, forced labor, taxation, monetizing the economy, and paying low wages. The first strategy was conquest. So European powers took control of African territories by conquering them politically, economically, culturally, and socially. Do remember that Europeans needed raw materials for their industries, right? But the way African economies were organized didn't guarantee a steady supply. So they sought to take over and control the economy and administration of African regions. So, for example, if they needed palm oil for soap making, they forced Africans to produce it in large quantities to ensure a consistent supply. And without this control, people might have felt free to choose to grow yams instead based on their local demand, right? And the colonialists also took control to produce the type of food needed for their industrial workers back in Europe. And in doing so, they basically reshaped African economies to focus on producing raw materials rather than manufacturing their own goods. This is a pattern that still affects many African economies to this day. They also began to take occupancy of whatever land they wanted, and they maintained control through violence and conquest. So entire African communities were displaced or exterminated to make way for European settlers. Take, for example, South Africa, where the Bushmen were expelled from their homelands, or in some cases exterminated entirely. So where expulsion were deemed unprofitable, the European resorted to clever legal tricks. In Bechuanaland in 1897, now Botswana, for instance, a small riot involving a few drunken locals was used as a pretext for expelling 8,000 of the locals from land secured to them by the Bechuanaland Annexation Act of 1895. The rest of the population of 30,000 of them were forcibly evacuated to other and poorer districts. And the land was confiscated and was turned over to the British occupation. And other property besides land was also confiscated. For instance, after the Matabele War, wholesale confiscation of the cattle of the Matabele for the purpose of stocking the farms of the white settlers provoked a second war. And the subsequent defeat of the Matabele led to further confiscation of their cattle. And after this happened, one of the people whose cattle had been confiscated said the following. So in despair, the conquered complained by saying the following: "Our country is gone and our cattle. We have nothing to live for. Our women are deserting us. The white man does as he likes with them. We are the slaves of the white man. We are nobody and we have no rights or laws of any kind." So the creation of a labor supply from the dispossessed locals was a secondary issue because these people originally lived off the land, farming and working to support themselves. And once they lost their land, they had no choice but to work for the colonialists. Even though they did not want to, they were forced to do so in order to survive and basically support their families. But the colonial grip didn't stop there. Another key strategy was taxation. While some African societies were already paying taxes to local rulers, either in cash or goods, the colonialists demanded taxes be paid in their own currency. And this meant Africans had to work in colonial industries, plantations, or civil service to earn the currency required for taxes, creating a consistent labor pool. And there were two main reasons the colonialists imposed taxes on Africans. But the tax was not just imposed to create labor force. They wanted the colonies to fund their own administration, as the European governments did not want to use their own resources to manage the territories. So their policy was that the cost of running the colonies should be raised locally. And the consequence for not paying tax were so severe, so Africans feared missing payments, and the colonialists had an efficient system for collecting taxes, with detailed records of adult taxpayers in each community. And in some areas, traditional leaders were used to help with the collection. So Africans were made to believe that the paying taxes was a civic duty to the state. And if someone failed to pay their taxes, they were treated like a criminal, as if they had committed a crime against the state. And this harsh approach forced a lot of adult African men to seek employment in colonial service to earn enough money for their taxes. And Africans were not familiar with this new system and wouldn't willingly offer their labor. And to make Africans work in mines, sugar plantations, and industries, colonialists used other strategies as well. So, where taxation did not produce enough labor, laws were introduced that forced people to work for public projects when called upon by the chiefs or local leaders. And in 1895, such a law was passed in the Gold Coast, requiring chiefs to produce carriers for a military expedition against the Ashanti. And in South Africa, when chiefs did not supply enough workers, local police were actually sent to collect them. And to meet the growing demand for labor in the mines, even more effective methods than forced labor were deployed. And the colonialists aimed to basically break the tribal system, which provided some economic and political strength to the native people. Now, some humane missionaries thought this plan went too far. They thought it immoral and demurred against their sentimental qualms about destroying the tribal system of locals. Lofty arguments were put forward. A magistrate declared that the labor question and the land question are indissoluble, right, bound together. He said, in my opinion, it is of little use framing enactments to compel unwilling persons to go out to work. It is like the old saying about leading a horse to the water. You can take him there, but you cannot make him drink. And in the same way, you may impose your labor tax, but you cannot make your unwilling person work. Create a healthy thirst in your horse, and he will drink fast enough. And he continued to say that similarly, to create the necessity for the native to work, and he will work like none other. So hitherto, under our commercial tenure system, there has been little absolute necessity for our young natives to leave their homes to work. The land supplies them with food, and a few shillings will buy a blanket. And as soon as the young man marries, he's entitled to receive his lot of arable land. But once this is stopped, and it will be stopped by the survey and individual tenure, a young man, before he marries a wife, will have to be in a position to support a wife. And to obtain this, he must work to maintain her and himself. And once the necessity of work is created, there will be no lack of men ready and willing to work. So quickly reassured by such magisterial opinion, right? The humanitarian missionaries dismissed their qualms and went along with the plan. And another key tactic the colonialists used to control African territories was the monetization of African economy. Now, before colonization, the African economy was mostly based on bantering. Even when some form of currency existed, it was not widely accepted, often too heavy and difficult to divide into smaller units. So these currencies did not function well as a modern medium to exchange. And to integrate Africa into the global economy and trade, the colonialists introduced their own currency, making it easy for them to control its value and usage, thus maintaining control over both the African economy and administration. And the colonialists made it hard for Africans to obtain currency by keeping the prices of raw materials and agricultural products produced by Africans very low. And at the same time, the goods manufactured by the colonialists were priced too high. This meant that Africans had to work harder and longer to afford a small amount of foreign goods. And as a result, Africans grew poorer while the colonialists continued to increase their profits. And since the colonialists controlled the currency in African territories, they dedicated the direction of the economic and political development, right? So they basically had a grip of it, all of it. And the introduction of a currency system became a tool of imperial control, allowing the colonialists to maintain dominance over African territories. And the final piece of this control was through low wages. So African workers were paid just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. And this ensured that entire families had to work in colonial service just to make ends meet. The low wages system was just as effective as any other method used to maintain control over African territories. And by taking control of land and resources, colonialists created a labor supply of dispossessed locals who had no choice but to work for the colonizers. And this led to a deeply exploitative system where African workers were forced into labor under brutal conditions simply to survive. Having by conquest become masters of the continent, the European rulers of Africa continue to organize their rule for a long and profitable stay. In conclusion, the historical journey of Africa from pre-colonial times through the colonial period has profoundly shaped its current economic and social landscape. And pre-colonial Africa was characterized by abundant land and scarce labor, fostering a unique balance that minimized conflicts and allowed for specialized trade, particularly in regions like West Africa. However, the advent of colonialism brought drastic changes driven by European industrial demands and imperial ambitions. Colonial powers imposed control through conquest, forced labor, taxation, and economic restructuring, fundamentally altering African societies. They exploited Africa's resources and labor, reshaping economies to serve European interests and creating a legacy of economic dependency and social disruption. The introduction of a currency system, low wages, and the monetization of the economy further entrenched colonial dominance. And understanding these historical dynamics, I think, is crucial for comprehending the contemporary challenges and opportunities facing Africa. I think as we reflect on this history, it becomes evident that the impact of colonialism are still felt today, still with us today, influencing economic policies, social structures, and development trajectories. And moving forward, it is essential, I think, to acknowledge this past while striving for a future that leverages Africa's rich heritage and potential for sustainable growth and prosperity. Thank you so much for being with us for this episode, and I hope to see you next time. Continue to come along.